Let me know if this has ever been you. You're enrolled in an English class and you've read the assigned story. You understand it and you can explain what happened. But then you freeze when you're asked to critically think about it and analyze it. Or you write what feels like a solid analysis but get feedback that says, go deeper, be more specific, move beyond summary, or develop the idea. That feedback is frustrating because it's vague and it often sounds like do better thinking without being told how. This scenario is actually one of the most common complaints high school and college students cite again and again. So here is the promise of this lecture. By the end of it, how to critically think about literature will no longer be confusing, and instead, it will become a repeatable method that you can use on any text, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, classic or contemporary, or assigned for school or read for personal interest. If you're new here, my name is Dr. Whitney Kosters, and I have been an English professor for over 20 years. And I've created this channel for people who read literature, sense there's meaning there, but aren't quite sure how to explain it or write about it. My lectures show how literature works and how to turn those insights into strong, clear writing. So if that is something you might find useful, be sure to subscribe. Now, the first thing to understand when it comes to critical thinking and reading is that literature is never just telling a story. It is always constructing meaning in that it's making deliberate choices that suggest something about human behavior, values, power, desire, fear, identity, morality, trust, or truth, to name just a few things. It chooses what to reveal, what to delay, what to repeat, what to emphasize, what to make uncomfortable, and what to treat as normal. Critical thinking, then, is the skill of noticing these choices and then explaining what they do. Once you start explaining what those choices do, you're no longer just observing the text, you're interpreting it. And any interpretation requires taking a position about meaning, which, in the context of literary analysis, is called an argument. Now, the word argument can make people tense because they often picture conflict. But in reading and writing, an argument is simply a claim that can be examined. In nonfiction, the claim may be stated directly, but in literature, the claim is often developed through patterns and consequences. Either way, a text is guiding the reader toward certain judgments, and critical thinking is how a reader identifies what is being claimed, how it's being supported, and what the text is encouraging the reader to accept. Now, this is also where readers get stuck, so I want to make the difference very clear. A passive reader asks, what happened? Did I like it? Who was right and who was wrong? What is the theme? Now, those questions aren't useless, but they tend to produce writing that sounds generic because the answers could apply to almost any story. A critical reader asks a different set of questions. What does this text seem to be saying about this idea? What does it reward and what does it punish? What does it normalize? What does it challenge? What does it expect me to assume? What does it refuse to say directly? Once a reader begins asking these questions, analysis becomes possible because the focus has shifted from personal reaction to explanation. So let me give you a method that works. I call it claim, pattern, consequence, and it's simple enough to remember, but powerful enough to run an entire essay. First is the claim. What does the text seem to be saying about a big idea such as ambition, loyalty, authority, freedom, guilt, belonging, shame, or identity? Notice the wording here. What does it seem to be saying? That phrasing matters because literature often complicates ideas rather than giving straightforward lessons. Second is pattern. What repeats in the text that supports that claim? In literature, evidence is often not a single quote that states the message. It's usually a pattern, like a repeated image, conflict, choice, consequences, or silence. These patterns are important because they transform a single moment into meaning. Third is consequence. What happens because of those patterns, and what is the text encouraging the reader to conclude? This is the step that separates observation from interpretation. A reader can notice something, but a reader who critically thinks explains what that something does. Let me show you how this works with a quick example that doesn't require any particular story. Imagine a story in which a character keeps trying to tell the truth, but every time he does, the truth is treated as rude, disruptive, or unacceptable. The character is pressured to soften his language, perform politeness, or just remain silent. If that happens once, it could be an isolated moment, but if it happens repeatedly, it's a pattern. And once it becomes a pattern, you can make a claim. The story is suggesting that social comfort is valued more than truth, and then you can explain the consequence. The reader begins to see politeness not as kindness, but as control, and that changes how the entire story is understood. So that's claim, pattern, consequence. If a paragraph has all three, it's doing analytical work. Now, to make this even more usable for you, I'm going to give you 6 questions that function as a checklist. These questions prevent rambling because they force focus, and they also prevent shallow theme statements because they force specificity. First, what does the text want me to notice most? Look for what repeats, what stands out, what is emphasized, and what becomes unavoidable. Second, what does the text refuse to explain directly? Silence and avoidance matter. Normalizing something questionable matters too. Writers definitely don't accidentally skip information that would change interpretation. Third, what does the text reward and punish? Pay attention to who benefits, who suffers, who is believed, who is dismissed, who gains power, and who loses power. Consequence is one of the clearest signals of value. Fourth, who gets to speak with authority and who is treated as unreliable or insignificant. This shows up in dialogue, narration, social roles, and the way other characters respond. Fifth, what changes and what stays the same? When change does happen, how does the text frame it? As growth, loss, compromise, corruption, liberation? When nothing changes, ask why. Sixth, if someone disagreed with my interpretation, what evidence would they point to? That is the question that sharpens everything because it forces intellectual honesty in that it makes you anticipate an alternative reading and refine your own. Once you've used those questions, the next step is turning reading into writing without slipping back into summary, because that is another place that people really get stuck. They think they're analyzing, but the paragraph turns into plot retelling with a quote just dropped into the middle. So here is a practical move that forces analysis. After any quote, follow with 3 sentences that do 3 different jobs. First, point to a specific feature of the language, such as a word choice, an image, a contrast, a shift, or even a contradiction. Second, explain the effect of that feature, meaning what it encourages the reader to notice, feel, suspect, or conclude. And third, connect that effect back to the paragraph's claim so the reader understands why that evidence belongs there. That 3-sentence follow-up is one of the simplest ways to make thinking visible on the page, and it is exactly what most instructors mean when they say go deeper. They're asking for explanation, not more quotes or more plot or opinions. Critical thinking in literature requires resisting the urge to moralize too quickly. I think readers often want a text to just be divided neatly into heroes and villains, right and wrong, good decisions and bad. Literature often frustrates that desire on purpose because it's more interested in pressure, contradiction, compromise, fear, desire, power, and consequence. And also, I think because it's just a more accurate version of the way our world works. We live primarily in gray rather than black and white, and I think literature often tries to reflect that dynamic. So a critical reader doesn't remove moral judgment. They delay certainty long enough to understand complexity, because complexity is where meaning usually sits. And this is one of the reasons literature matters personally. A well-written story can clarify why a relationship feels confusing, why a workplace feels controlling, why someone behaves in contradictory ways, and why good intentions can still cause harm. In that way, literature often works as a reminder of our shared humanity, showing patterns of fear, desire, power, and vulnerability that repeat across different lives. Critical thinking helps us recognize those connections rather than treating each story as isolated or purely fictional. So remember, critical thinking turns reading into insight rather than reaction, and that shift is useful in school, in work, and truly in everyday life. You'll become sharper, more observant, and more thoughtful if you continue to practice these tools beyond the classroom. Before I end, I want to add one final tool that strengthens critical thinking across the board. Pay attention to reasoning. When a conclusion feels too easy, ask what was skipped, what was assumed, what was exaggerated, and what was oversimplified. That habit connects directly to logical fallacies, which I talk more about in detail in a separate lecture, and I have linked below. So remember, critical thinking in literature is not mysterious or reserved for a special kind of reader. It's just a simple method. Identify the claim, track the pattern, explain the consequence, and use targeted questions that force specificity. Support interpretations with evidence and then spend most of the paragraph explaining what that evidence does and why it matters. Once you do this consistently, reading changes, writing changes, and analysis becomes controlled rather than uncertain. As always, thank you for spending a few minutes of your day with me. If you found this lecture useful, please consider subscribing so you don't miss out on future lectures. Thanks so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video. Be well.